Okay, so I have my basic environment here, and what you can see is I have a standalone installation of Tomcat. The reason I've done a standalone installation is generally in practice we will see that people will have a dedicated web server, for example, which then talks through to the back-end Uniface application server. So in this case, it wouldn't make sense to install the whole of Uniface on a web server. Installing Tomcat itself is as simple as downloading the files from the Apache site and unzipping the folder. It does come with an executable installer if you want, but ultimately all that executable installer will do at the same time is, under the bin folder, it will run the service.bat, and that will just install it as a service. In general, I just go for the unzip method. So to show, this is pretty much a default install. One thing I've added, and if you remember from the architecture diagram, is I've added a second virtual host. So web apps here is the standard host, and I'm just not going to touch that. That has all of the defaults in, which I'll just leave for reference. And here I've created web apps prod, which is my hardened version, or the version I'm going to harden further. If we go to the conf Catalina, we can see localhost, that's the one that goes to web apps, and my production one, www.uniface.org.uk, is the one that will be hardening, and that's the domain that I'm going to use on my certificate. So let's go to the top level. If I just start up Tomcat, and I go to my application, it's just a regular DSP application, responsive for mobile if required. I can just do things. I mean, it's just a regular app. Currently running, well, you can see it just says there blatantly, it's not secure, and that's because it's just running on HTTP. If I try to go to HTTPS, naturally, site can't be reached because I've not enabled it. So let's step through the steps to enable SSL. Go to my command line. I've got a keys folder where I'm going to create my keys. And the first thing I said we need to do is create an empty key store. Now, I can't remember the command lines myself, but they're well documented and I will share them. Literally all I do is call the generate the key store. Now, to generate the key store, I do have to generate a temporary certificate, which I'll call foo in this case. Key store password. Remember, the password will have to be the same. I'm going to use let me in. Let me in. And now it's just asking me for information for the certificate. Because this is just a temporary dummy certificate, I'm just going to enter anything I want because I'm going to delete it straight away anyway. Okay, so that's my key store created. So you can just see it there, truststore.jks. Now I just need to delete that temporary key I created, or temporary certificate, because I don't actually need it in there. So that's my key store created and ready for me to generate my actual certificates and put them in. Now, if you were talking about a production environment, you would go to one of the many trusted root providers. I mean, if you look at the certificate authorities on your machine, you can see a whole list of certificate authorities. Now, in terms of what I'm going to do, I've created my own certificate authority because I'm just doing this in a development context, and within that context, I know I've got control over the certificates for the certificate authority, so I can do this in-house internally with no problems. So let's do that. I've created those certificates using a small utility called XCA. there's plenty of other utilities out there, and there's also other free certificate providers online. The only caution I would say with some of the free providers online is you are adding those as a trusted authority, so ultimately anybody else who's generated certificates from them will appear as a trusted website. Now, that might seem okay, however, the difference between getting one of the free certificates and one from one of the commercial organisations is when you get it from a commercial organisation, you have to absolutely prove your identity, whether that's your incorporation records from your company or whatever it may be. You have to prove your identity. With the free ones you don't, so technically they aren't guaranteeing that the website is actually secure or who it says it is. Okay, so let me open my database and create a new certificate. So we can see my CA that I created previously. If you use this tool or similar, you'll see they're all quite intuitive. So I'll say new certificate. A couple of things to do. Pick the signature algorithm. This one says SHA1. That's considered far too weak and will get rejected by things such as Chrome. So I'm going to go for 256. To save me time, I've defined a template which will fill in most of the values I need. I'm using my Uniface certificate authority here. I go to the subject. I need to set the subject to be Tomcat, which is the alias that Tomcat will look for when it looks at the key store. Everything else I've just pre-filled, which is just details on my organisation. Now, something to be aware of is common name is the domain name that you're connecting to, and up till maybe a month, 2 months ago, that was good enough. However, the finer detail of the specification for certificates says we shouldn't rely on common name. So when you are requesting certificates or generating them yourself, you need to also make sure you add the subject alternative name. And you can see here I've specified that as URI and my domain name, and DNS and my domain name. I talked about the certificates being a public-private key pair, so here I'll just generate the private key. Where's that beeping up? Okay, so that's my key created. So what I now need to do is import both of those into my key store in Tomcat. So I'll start off by exporting them. So I'll export the certificate authority. The certificate authority needs to be exported in DER format. And as I mentioned, the key pair for your domain needs to be exported in PKS12 format. Give it a password. Again, the password needs to be the same, so I'll do let me in. And we can see that I've got those keys in the folder now. Just rename that file. Okay, so I'll now import these into the key store. Again, I can't remember the command line, but it's just a copy and paste effort, and this will be made available to you. So I'll import the CA certificate first. Trusted certificate, yes. And now I'll import the certificate for the domain. Okay, so that's imported successfully. We can just verify that by listing the keys. And so we can see there's the root certificate and there's my Tomcat certificate. So we're now ready to enable SSL. So the next step was to uncomment the SSL connector and add the appropriate attributes. So I'll go to my Tomcat installation, conf, go into server XML, edit that, and we'll now go through. Now as I scroll down, I'm going to change one of the other options I mentioned earlier, which was a shutdown port while I'm here. I don't want people to be able to shut down the server remotely, so I'm changing that to -1 now. If I carry on down to the connectors, we can see here's the template connector that comes with Tomcat, and I've made my own version of it. So I've uncommented this one. Here you can see I've specified the address attribute, binding it to my particular card. Here you can see I've specified the server attribute I mentioned before to make sure we don't volunteer information. And then what we see down here is key store pass, let me in, and key store file, the path to my key store that I just created. So trust store there. The other attribute that I've added, which I mentioned in the presentation, was the ciphers. So here we can see ciphers and the big long list. And again, I'll show you where you can find that list on the net. Okay, so if I now save this and restart Tomcat, when I now go to my site, this is the non-secure version. So if I change to HTTPS, we can now see that I've got a secure site. So I click on it, secure connection. Again, if I do it in Internet Explorer, we'll get the golden padlock in Internet Explorer to say that it's secure. So that's already infinitely improved the security of the site in terms of the confidentiality and data integrity. We'll now look at more of the hardening options. Okay, so if I go back into the web app folders, if I take a look at Tomcat itself, the default installation, if I go to my local host address instead, so going via the different host that's defined, I've clearly broken something. Okay, don't worry about that. Anyone who's gone to the Tomcat default site has seen that it volunteers all the information. It says, welcome to Tomcat, this is the version, click here for the manager, click here for the docs, and all sorts of stuff. And all of that is coming from things like the root directory, the examples folder with various servlets, etc. in there, the host manager, etc. All sorts of things that you don't want deployed in a production app. So when we look at my actual hardened version, I don't have any of the extra stuff. And if I go to the root folder, I've just got a couple of basic pages in there, a default index page and a default error page. Again, these don't volunteer any information. Welcome to Uniface, and here's a hyperlink to the main page. Again, my default error page, internal server error, and that's it. Doesn't give any more information than that. So that's getting rid of the default apps. Go back into server XML. Well, we already talked about the shutdown port, which I did previously, and then we also saw that I added the server attribute. again, to make sure we don't volunteer any unwanted information. The other thing that's added in server XML that I mentioned is the auto deployment. We don't want anything auto deployed if someone were to actually manage to get a WAR file on there. So again, I've already added the attributes auto deploy false and unpack WARs is false. Okay. The other thing to do in here is we want to make sure that I've said bind to the appropriate network cards, and so we've seen that already. So if I go back to my connector here, we can see that I've already added the address tab. If I weren't to do that and someone stuck another network card in there, or even by say a USB dongle, that would potentially give them access to something I don't want them to have direct access to. So again, I'm binding this to a specific network card. The other thing I need to do is, here we can see the AJP connector that I don't actually want used because I'm not using IIS or Apache to connect, for example, so I can just get rid of that, and that removes another listener. Okay, so let me close that. The next thing to do at a global level, we talked about the reducing the default documents. So if we go into here in the web XML at the top layer, if I edit this file, go straight to the bottom, and near the bottom you will find the welcome list. So in general, I'm not too worried about a HTML file. However, I will delete the HTML one because I know my files are just called HTML. The JSP file I would be more worried about because that's something that will be interpreted and executed, and I know I'm not using JSP, so I'll delete that as well. Something else we talked about while we're in this file was changing the default error pages. And what I'll do is I'll demonstrate a default error page. If I do something like file not found, I get the 404. So what you'll see after I enable this and refresh this page, we will get my standard error page. It won't volunteer any information about what's actually gone wrong, you just know something has gone wrong. So I'll uncomment this section. Finally, something else I want to do, especially seeing the performance improvement you actually get with SSL as well as the increased security, is I want to force SSL. So if I go to HTTP, I want it to redirect to SSL automatically. So I just add this declaration, which is basically saying for every URL it has to be confidential, therefore it will redirect. So if I save this file, restart Tomcat, I have to restart every time because I've said not to auto deploy and not to automatically reload. So the two things we'll now see are this message is now the default error message. It's giving me no information about what's actually gone wrong. I'm just giving a message saying internal server error. Again, that page could just say welcome to your application. The other thing you can see happened automatically and maybe didn't spot straight away is that it went straight to HTTPS. If I try going back to a non-secure connection, it's straight onto secure. So again, not only improving performance a bit there, but you are now ensuring that an application cannot be deployed in an insecure way, or that when you're developing, if you were to inadvertently put HTTP in instead of HTTPS, well, you can be sure it will be automatically diverted. Okay, a couple of other things to do. One of the things I mentioned was a WRD version. If I call a URL and after WRD specify the component name WRD version, it's giving me information, Uniface test middleware. That's useless information to an end user, but potentially valuable information to a hacker. So we'll go into the webinf folder and we'll disable that. So in my web XML, edit that. There's my WRD servlet. I'll set testable to false. The other thing to do in here is the timeouts I mentioned. So what you'll find, again, I've just got my block that I've already predefined. Session timeout, and I'm saying a session timeout of 20 minutes. Again, this very much depends on the application you're building and the target users. It could be a 5-minute timeout might be appropriate. This is just a number for you to pick. Naturally, I'm not going to demonstrate a 20-minute timeout because I assume nobody wants to sit here for 20 minutes while we wait for it to time out. But what I will show is the change the testables made. So this time, I now get a yellow screen because it's actually trying to run a component in Uniface called WRD_version. But what you can see here is this is volunteering loads of information now. So we'll get rid of that. If I go to my assignment file, wasv.asn, scroll down in here, we have the set of logicals I mentioned. And what I'm doing with this set of logicals is replicating my default error page. So I'm saying 505 internal error, and then the body of the document. Saying message frame false because again I don't want to volunteer any information at all. So if I save that, I will kill the use server directly. And when I refresh this time, we just get my default error page. Again, it's not telling me or volunteering any information at all. The other type of Uniface error I mentioned was the red screen. So in this case, I've defined a servlet called WRD2 where I know I've put the wrong password in. So when I do, I need to actually run a real component. Or try to run a real component. I get the red screen there because, well, failure to connect to the U router. Again, that's given me too much information. So what I mentioned to fix this issue, or this vulnerability, is we go into the context. So Messenger is my application in this case, webinf, and here we can see the default error files and the default template, which you can see, yep, volunteers information. So what I've got instead is another set I've created, and these ones do not volunteer information because again these just reflect that standard error page. So again, go through the process of restarting Tomcat because this is a WRD change. And this time I get my standard error page. So again, you can see all of these things that are typically volunteering information are just being closed down. Okay, a couple more changes that we've talked about. In the context.xml, I said we should add use HTTP only, particularly where we know we don't want the cookies to be manipulated at the client side or read at client side. So I just changed the context attribute, or add the use HTTP only attribute to the context. And further down, well, very slightly further down, we can see that we have these watched resources here, which basically say to reload Tomcat if the files that are being watched are changed. Well, I don't want that to happen, so I'll comment out that block. Again, I could just as easily delete the block. Almost made a typo there, which would have been hard to find. Okay, so I made a change there. Restart Tomcat. Again, site continues to work normally. Okay, so then the last point I mentioned, which particularly applies to the websites as such, was the filters. Now, enabling the filters is quite straightforward. Go into the server XML. And in the host section, we can add the standard Tomcat rewrite filter. You can see this is against my Uniface org UK domain. And that's now enabled the filter. The filter itself, or the filter rules, are defined in this file called rewrite config. And this is the one I showed in the presentation. And the key thing you can see here is I'm saying if I type talk in at the URL, this maps onto the application. So I need to restart Tomcat one more time. So what we'll see happen now is when I type in talk, application still runs normally. Not getting any information volunteered in the URL. Application itself still works normally. But the interesting or good side effect of the nature of these URLs, I say side effect, it's actually completely intentional, is that if I try to do things such as run the standard URL, so messenger wrd main, I get the internal server error because I've defined that that's not a valid entry point. And again, if I try to go to any of the other components I know exist, again, I get the internal server error. So again, we're therefore masking information, and even if someone takes a look at, F12 and starts looking at the network tab to see what is actually being requested and going backwards and forwards, they can't make use of that information anyway, because if they type it in, it's not going to work. Now, if they know the techniques I've used, for example, looking at the referrer, they could use tools to try and guess what I've set the referrer to and maybe try to bypass this mechanism. However, you are then getting into the realms of a serious hacker, but for something like this, this will protect you against accidental hackers. Okay, so that's pretty much it in terms of the hardening techniques you can use. As I say, these are just, it's an ongoing process, it's not just a one-time event. So the things I've shown you today are very applicable today, considered the right things to do today, but give it a year, people will discover new flaws, new weaknesses, new exploits, and so we'll have to, again, adapt what we do and improve it moving forwards. Okay, so just come back to the presentation. Just a couple of resources to bear in mind. The Tomcat security documentation is very good and walks you through a lot of the things I've mentioned today. So that's just the Apache site, and there's documentation for each version of Tomcat. Tomcat is on later versions. The reason I've used version 8 today is because that's the version we ship with Uniface, and so is the version you'll be familiar with. In terms of that list of ciphers to use with Tomcat, if you go to the OWASP site, you'll find updated and current lists of the recommended ciphers to use. Something else that's very useful when you're setting these things up is the SSL server test site. What this site does, is basically you type in your host name and then it will run a whole bunch of tests and tell you what the potential exploits are or weaknesses. It takes a few minutes to run, and I'll just show you an example output file. So I did this against our new showcase server. Got an overall rating of B, so we need to do a little bit of work on that to make it a bit more secure. And when you go through, it basically tells you all the different types of tests it's done, and it will tell you where you've got some weaknesses. So, okay, we just saw a couple of reds. So, okay, IE6, the server closed the connection. That's fine, because I'm not worried about supporting IE6. To go back up, these ones I am more worried about because we have a couple of ciphers defined, or actually 3 ciphers defined, 2 of which are considered insecure and one which is considered weak. So that's a potential exploit point. So we need to go to that server and basically remove those ciphers. Again, you go through and the report will just tell you other things. So what we've got here, RC4, and again it's saying that's insecure. So it's a very good site to just point at your deployments before you actually go into live production. So finally, just to summarize everything, security is a huge topic. We've got lots to consider, but one of the main things is to actually take it very seriously and coach and mentor your whole team, because we're all responsible at all layers. Continual monitoring and improvement is essential. I mean, everything I've talked about today, there will be enhancements and changes in the future. But what you can see is with what are effectively a few simple steps, you massively improve the security. As I say, it's a lot to take in today, but we will make everything I've shown available to you after this session. Server hardening is just one of the steps on the path to security, but as I said at the start, this is the first in a series of lectures where we will cover more items such as our TLS drivers, path scramblers, and just general good practice in terms of application security. Another thing, don't assume the higher or lower layers are providing adequate security. Basically, make sure you take responsibility for what you produce and just do the best job you can at that layer, and communicate to the rest of the organization to do the same on the parts they're responsible for. 100% security, again, as I say, it is practically impossible because we've always got that human element. We're always going to have potential mistakes out there. The key thing to do is make sure you've got a risk mitigation program or risk management program. Again, as I say, 100% secure system would be technically unusable. Okay, so I hope that's given you some tools that you're going to be able to take away and apply. As I say, our goal was something that you could take away today and apply immediately. And I'm hoping things such as the filters and just some of the hardening you've seen on Tomcat, you can literally start experimenting with and apply right away.